Napoleon Bonaparte was once the most powerful man in Europe. As Emperor of France, he led massive armies and won some of history's most famous battles. At the height of his power, much of Europe was under his control, but every empire eventually falls. And for Napoleon, that fall would lead him to a lonely island, thousands of kilometers away from everything he once ruled. This is the story of Napoleon's exile. By 1814, after years of war across Europe, Napoleon's enemies had finally gained the upper hand. A coalition of European powers invaded France and captured Paris. Facing defeat, Napoleon was forced to give up his throne. Instead of executing him, the victorious nations sent him into exile on a small island called Elba in the Mediterranean Sea. Although Elba was small, Napoleon was still allowed to keep the title of emperor and govern the island. For most people, this would have been the end of the story. But Napoleon was not ready to give up. In February 1815, he escaped from Elba and returned to France. To the shock of Europe, thousands of soldiers joined him. The French king fled, and Napoleon once again became ruler of France. His return became known as the 100 Days. However, the nations of Europe quickly united against him. They raised new armies and prepared for war. The final battle took place on June 18, 1815, near Waterloo in present-day Belgium. The battle was fierce, but by the end of the day, Napoleon had suffered a crushing defeat. His dream of rebuilding his empire was over. After Waterloo, Napoleon returned to Paris and abdicated for the second time. This time, the Allies were determined that he would never escape again. They selected a remote island called Saint Helena. Located in the South Atlantic Ocean, Saint Helena was one of the most isolated places on Earth. There would be no easy way back to Europe. In October 1815, Napoleon arrived on the island. The former emperor of France was now a prisoner. He lived in a house called Longwood House. The conditions were far less comfortable than the palaces he had once known. British guards watched him closely, and his movements were restricted. Far from the battlefields and courts of Europe, Napoleon spent much of his time reading, writing, and reflecting on his life. He often discussed his military campaigns and dictated his memories to his companions. Even in exile, he wanted to shape how future generations would remember him. As the years passed, his health began to decline. He suffered from frequent illness and stomach pain. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died on Saint Helena at the age of 51. The man who had once ruled much of Europe died far from home, surrounded by only a small group of loyal followers. But his story did not end there. Nearly 20 years later, in 1840, Napoleon's remains were returned to France. Thousands of people gathered to honor the former emperor. Today, Napoleon rests in Paris, beneath one of the most famous tombs in the world.